Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave McKee with the Portville Kearney Bozeman Trail Association, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our program this afternoon on firearms. Just a little bit of introduction on the topic, so thanks to Carrie. So what we're trying to accomplish today is review the history along the Bozeman Trail, where early cattle drives and western settlement were influenced by the technological advances and design innovations of firearms and native weaponry. Today's program, Firearms That Influenced the Powder River Country, will explore military and commercial firearms and their relationship to local and regional historic events from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. So today's program is made due to a partnership with the Fortville Kearney State Historic Site, so thank you to the state. Lindley, our Fortville Kearney Bozeman Trail Association, the Sheridan Community Land Trust, and Sheridan County Sportsman Association. So all our groups got together to join in and put this together. And we would like to do a special thanks to the Sheridan County Sportsmen's Association for sponsoring free admission for the morning portion of the program at the fort. So thanks to the Sportsmen's Association. Also wanted to let people know that today's presentations will be video recorded and shared on the Sheridan County Community Land Trust and Fortville Kearney's YouTube channel. So if you want to review it or let your friends know about it, we'll have that on the YouTube channel for viewing down the road. And we would like to thank the Wyoming Humanities Council for funding the documentation today. And because we're fortunate to get some funding from the Humanities Council, we do have a survey for people to fill out, a short survey. It's back on the Sheridan Community Land Trust table that we turn into the Humanities Council. It's part of the grant. So if you would take time to just do a quick survey, that would be wonderful. So I think with that, we'll start our presentations this afternoon. So what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, Danny Michael, who started at the Cody Firearms Museum as the Assistant Curator in 2016. In addition to assisting with visitor inquiries and researching and writing about the collection, he also managed social media content for the Firearms Museum. He was promoted to Associate Curator in 2020 and is now the Robert W. Woodruff Curator of the Cody Firearms Museum. Michael received a master's degree from the University of Louisville in 2016 in public history. Michael, thanks so much for coming and welcome.
Adjust this slightly for whoever's next, sorry. Stand up a little higher. Back up. Can everybody hear me from this? A little better? Okay. I don't want to break anything. There we go. How's that? Better? All right. Well, I just want to say a quick thank you to Carrie for inviting me over here today to talk with you all and be a part of the program, and to all the groups that were a part of putting this event together. I really appreciate being included and having the chance to share some history with you. So I'm Danny Michael. I am the curator now over at the Cody Firearms Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West over in Cody. So if you're looking for something to do sometime, go over the mountains and come see us. I'm going to do my best to keep my talk on schedule today, but my dad is a pastor, so no promises. So just a little bit about me. I've had a long interest in firearms history. I think that's about 6 years old. And as I mentioned, I'm currently the curator of the Cody Firearms Museum. I feel very fortunate, very blessed to have that opportunity to work with a really amazing collection of firearms history. But today, of course, we're talking about firearms that influence this part of the northern plains and the Rockies in this area of what's now Wyoming. And so, of course, one of the first groups I want to talk about, and I've tried to break this down into the people that would be using these firearms. So we'll have a couple categories of folks that would be using firearms in this area historically, and hopefully some of our other presenters will dive a little bit deeper into those topics. But of course, one of the first groups I thought about were mountain men, excuse me. Of course, as people came across the plains and encountered the Rocky Mountains, we get that iconic mountain man figure, somebody like Jedediah Smith here. The reason I picked him specifically is because that pistol over at the museum that we have fortunately on loan to us right now is attributed to Smith, to his usage. And he spent a lot of time all over the West, both northern plains, southern plains. But the kind of gun that he carried sort of early in the West would have been something like this flintlock pistol. This is a Birmingham-made flintlock pistol. It's a single-shot muzzle loader, as most of these first guns I'll be talking about were. So you load your powder and your projectile down the barrel. You put a little extra powder in the priming pan, and then the flint strikes the frizzen. That creates a spark, ignites that pan, and then that pan ignites the chamber and fires the gun. So single-shot muzzle-loading firearm, very common on the early plains. The early firearms you see out west would have been mostly flintlocks. And that's especially true of that pre-Civil War Western period that we're thinking of. A lot of, it's easy to think of the West as kind of a post-Civil War era, but it definitely gets started before that. And of course, if we're going to talk about mountain men, we have to mention what is they're most well known for. So the Plains rifle, or Hawken rifle, named for the most famous makers of this style rifle. The two pictured here are percussion muzzle-loading rifles made by the Hawken brothers, Jacob and Samuel Hawken. They worked primarily in St. Louis, but they worked a couple other places. They actually learned their trade back east. Jacob probably worked at the Harper's Ferry Arsenal early in his career. Their dad was also a gun maker, making more classic American long rifles, working in Western Maryland. So they learned the trade from him, and they adapted that American long rifle style into what we know. So the key features of a Hawken, or a Plains rifle, are a half stock. You can see the stock does not go the full length of the barrel. Typically, they had pretty heavy barrels. So the barrel's pretty thick, and they're usually mid 40 to mid 50 caliber. Some go up to 60. The American long rifle was usually a little bit smaller, say like 36 caliber to maybe 45, somewhere in there. The Plains rifles tended to have a larger caliber. They were a little bit shorter, but with a much heavier barrel, and then a half stock. Most of the rifles that the Hawken brothers made were percussion. They did make a few flintlocks, but by the time they were really active in their heyday in the late 40s and 1850s, they liked to build percussion rifles, and they kind of had a notoriety for they made it and the customer got it. You could have it in any caliber you wanted as long as it was 50 or, they made the rifles to suit them, and the customers kind of dealt with it. They also would have been pretty expensive for their day. As a comparison, this was kind of a higher end option if you were headed out west. And there I just included a photo. We have a nice photo. I don't know if it'll show up super well, but they're barrel stamped. So it's usually marked J or S Hawken on the barrel and the location of St. Louis commonly. You can find a few made in Denver. They stopped at a couple other places. They also had some relatives that were still active back east in the same time frame. So those flintlock pistols, maybe a percussion pistol, probably a percussion rifle. That's what I associate, and I think is pretty fair to associate with some of those early mountain men figures that would have been in this area, maybe traveling through this area. I think that's a pretty fair representation of what they would have had with them. Another group I thought I'd talk about were homesteaders. Of course, as white settlement moved out west, and especially after the Civil War, homesteaders looking for a new start tended to bring their firearms of some make with them. But the first one you might not expect. That's very much a military musket. That is a model 1816, US model 1816, originally started as a flintlock musket. This one was percussion converted during the Civil War. And the reason I included this, and it's still in its full military length configuration, is that one of the resources we have over at the Center of the West are the shipping records for a company called Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham. If you know your Civil War history, you may have heard of those folks before, but Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham was one of a number of major surplus dealers. after the Civil War. So they bought up all the leftover military goods and they sold them through catalogs to individuals, to other governments all over the world. And they shipped a lot of guns out west. And so we can look at their shipping records and see what they included. And the most common gun that they shipped was a percussion conversion flintlock musket. Whether it was a model 1822, 1816, whatever it was, they shipped those out west by the thousands. And it's the most common one that shows up in their records. Doesn't necessarily mean it was the most common out west, but I always say when I talk about Western firearms, it's important to remember that while things were, the latest and greatest was around, if you're a homesteader, you have a lot of value considerations to make. So a brand new shiny 1866 Winchester would be probably a better option, but that costs $30 or $35. This could be had for $1 or $2, and it makes an effective shotgun. So what we see in a lot of, especially family collections out west now, you see a lot of these were sent out west and then they shortened the barrel, they shortened the stock, and made it a really effective single shot shotgun. And you can hunt a lot of game with it, you can do a lot of things with that. And it's not the most effective, but it does a lot for you, and it's very, very cheap. So we see a lot of those percussion conversion muskets go out west. I think the last shipment we see in those records is like 1904 or something like that. So they sold these for many, many decades after the Civil War. Of course, maybe you're a little better off if you're a homesteader, maybe you're an ex-Union cavalryman. One of the things that happened at the end of the Civil War was if you were a Union soldier and in good standing, you could buy your service firearm from the government, usually at a pretty steep discount from what the government had paid for it. Some of the guns were sold for as little as $6. Most of them had been bought for $20 or $30 by the government. A good example of this would be a Spencer. So the Spencer, widely adopted by the Northern government in the Civil War. It's a 7-shot repeating firearm. So this one takes a metallic rimfire cartridge. There's a tubular magazine that goes through the buttstock, and you actually load that through a small door on the butt plate. 7 shots, there's a lever there that you work to advance the cartridge. You have to manually cock the hammer each time, but it's a repeating firearm. There were a lot of them in the Civil War, and if you're a homesteader that had just gotten out of the Army, it's very possible that you could have brought one of these with you. So for relatively inexpensively compared to that brand new Winchester I mentioned. And of course, the one that everybody likes to depict in TV and film is a nice double-barrel shotgun. These are very dramatic guns. They look great on camera, so most Westerns of some kind will show a homesteader wielding some kind of double barrel. And that's not entirely inaccurate. There are lots of cheap shotguns or inexpensive shotguns imported after the Civil War in the 1800s. There's all sorts of European makers. There's a lot of different house makers in the U.S., sort of trade name, store name guns. I've never actually seen a comprehensive list, but I'm sure it would go into the hundreds. But yeah, the classic sort of shotgun, it gets to that same reason you might want that surplus musket. This might be a little bit more expensive version, but kind of same concept. If you have one of these, you can hunt a lot of game. You can probably use it for self-defense. It's a really versatile thing to have in the West, and it's not too expensive. So if you're a homesteader on a budget, that's probably an interesting option to have. Of course, that one's cut down, what we might call a coach gun. And so I thought I'd show an actual coach gun from our collection beside it. The bottom there is a Winchester lever action 1887 shotgun. And this one I included for the fact that that one's actually marked to American Express. So, and that one's a documentable coach gun. One of the problems in firearms research is just how often things like coach guns that become very notorious get embellished a little nowadays. But this one we can actually document as sold to American Express and used as a real-life coach gun out in the West somewhere. We don't know exactly where though, but the common shotgun would be another thing that I would personally associate with homesteaders coming out West. Of course, we're just down the road from the fort, and the West has a lot to do with military history, the American West. And so we got to talk about the trapdoor Springfield. So the firearm pictured here is what we would call a 65-66, an Allen conversion, and I spelled Allen wrong on there, so apologies for that. It's with an I. Erskine Allen is the inventor of this system. And At the end of the Civil War, the Union, there's a theme that the Civil War has a pretty big shadow on firearms used in the West. But the Allen conversions, at the end of the Civil War, the Union government, the U.S. government had something like 1 million Springfield muskets on their hands, and they had a authorized strength for the Army shrunk down to 25,000 men. And so rather than adopting brand new firearms, they thought, well, we got all these sitting in a warehouse, let's convert these to breech loader. They had experimented with breech loaders sort of before the Civil War, but after the Civil War, they really saw the need for it. Allen comes up with a sort of simple conversion to the existing Springfield muskets. So normally during the Civil War, this would be muzzle-loaded, powder, projectile down the barrel, put a percussion cap on it when you're ready to fire. In this case, you pull the hammer to half cock, open the breech, insert a metallic cartridge, close the breech, full cock, and fire the gun. A lot quicker. These early Allen conversions were chambered for 50-70 instead of the more famous 45-70, but the principle is the same, and then variations on these trapdoors would be in service with the U.S. military out in the West until the Spanish-American War, when they were finally, with the adoption of the Craig Jorgensen, they were put in the warehouse. And then, of course, also with the Army, think of the Colt Single Action Army. It's in the name. And so the Colt 1873, this became the standard issue sidearm for the U.S. military. So most of those Western campaigns you read about that happened after 1873, the soldiers would have had some form of the Colt Single Action with them. It is officially, it can chamber 6 rounds. It's a 6-shot cylinder, chambered for the .45 Colt cartridge. Although commercial orders could be chambered for a number of other cartridges. The military versions usually had a 7.5-inch barrel, but that is a classic Western revolver. Became really classic as a Western revolver because Hollywood really liked to use them. And so when we think of the West, we often think of those Winchesters and Colts. Then there's a lot of truth to it. There's also a lot of, they were really convenient and available for filming when everybody was making spaghetti westerns. So, but the truth of it is that a lot of soldiers would have had these, especially mounted soldiers. Any cavalry detachments would have been carrying a Colt Single Action Army as a standard issue firearm in the West. One you might not think of, though, for a Western firearm is a Maxim machine gun, best known for being invented by Hiram Maxim and adopted by Germans, built on license as the Vickers as well for the UK. These guns are really associated with World War I, but the U.S. Army in the early 1900s was figuring out what in the world to do with these newfangled machine guns that were being invented, and they bought them in sort of bits and pairs and dozens and half dozens. They bought 1895 Brownings, they bought Maxim guns, they bought Hotchkiss guns, bought all sorts of things to try them out. And the reason I associate this one with the West is I can't find any actual engagements in the northern West where the Army used a Maxim machine gun. There's a couple engagements during the what's called the Punitive Expedition in Mexico in the Southwest. But here, just over in Yellowstone, when that became a national park, there was no National Park Service. So the garrisoning the park fell to the Army. And the Army just rotated troops through there, and they brought whatever was issued. So if that unit happened to have a machine gun detachment attached, because the Army was trying to figure out what to do with machine gun detachments, they brought their machine guns with them. So there's a couple of photos of troops in garrison doing Park Service duty in Yellowstone with their Maxim guns. Would be quite a sight today. And of course, another group you want to talk about with firearms out here in the West are the native uses of firearms. It's interesting to me, and I think when you get into firearms history, it's just interesting in general, that firearms often came ahead of settlement. They're very tradable goods, so as soon as Europeans arrive on the East Coast and start colonies there, they begin trading firearms with native groups there. Those firearms then get traded west faster actually than settlement moves across the continent. And of course, there's also some trade from the south, from Spanish colonies. There's even some trade from the Pacific Northwest, from Russian traders. So firearms get out to the West in some form pretty early. Those early years would not have included a Henry, but the firearm shown there on the screen is an 1860 Henry. And those were pretty widely used by Native Americans. Custer himself actually wrote in a letter one time complaining about how many repeaters were in the hands of the tribes, somewhat ironically given his fate. And the reason I picked the Henry is because of that letter, and of course because during the archaeological surveys of the Little Bighorn, there's quite a few 44 rimfire cartridges they excavated. So that would be indicative of either the Henry or the 1866 Winchester. The Henry came out in 1860, fired a 44 rimfire cartridge. You loaded it, there's a little tab on the receiver. You slide that all the way forward, rotate the end of the magazine tube to the side, slide 14 rounds into the magazine tube under the barrel, close the magazine up, and then work the lever to chamber around, and then you can fire your 14 or 14 plus 1 as quickly as you can work the lever. In contrast with the soldiers that would have been at Little Bighorn, they have that single shot breech loader. It's a lot more effective than the muzzle loader, but it's a lot slower than a 44 caliber Henry or the later Winchesters that were around. And of course, with native use of firearms, flintlocks and those kind of things stayed around for a little bit longer than they did in the hands of European settlers. So this trade musket is a flintlock musket, British made, but it dates to about 1860 by the time that percussion and cartridge guns have well and truly taken over, but there's still some use for flintlocks. So British makers, even as late as the 1860s, were making trade guns for trade guns as flintlocks and selling those in the West, which is not something we think of. We think of this as a little bit earlier. Often you would see these get shortened down, so they're easier to handle on horseback. This one's a little bit closer to how it would have been made originally. And then the last one that you might not think of is this Remington Keen. This bolt action, not commonly the first thing you think of when you think of native use of firearms, but these actually would show up a lot in the Indian Agency police departments that were formed as police on the reservations. The U.S. government bought a number of these Remington Keen bolt action rifles to use for those police forces. So they're commonly, there's quite a few bits of documentation about these being used by them. This is a bolt action rifle chambered in 4570, one of the first commercially available bolt action rifles actually. But that's one you might not think of for native use. And then we've covered a lot, and I'll try and wrap this up, but another thing I like to remind people of, that almost anything you can think of was used at some capacity in the American West. So photoed there is a Mauser C96 pistol, mostly associated with World War I history. This is a German military pistol used in World War I. It was invented in the 1890s, as the 96 suggests. It's a semi-automatic pistol, fires from a 10-round fixed magazine. But the photo there, and it will be tough to see the photo, but the photo actually shows a Mauser C96 in the hands of a Texas Ranger. So I think if you said, what gun did a Texas Ranger use, most of us would think of some form of revolver, but there exists at least one photo of a named Texas Ranger with a Mauser pistol. And the one I'll wrap up with is this photo of William F. Cody on a hunting trip in what is now Yellowstone National Park. And the guns you see here are what you'd expect. Some lever action rifles. You see Cody there himself is holding an 1895 Winchester. And then right in the middle of the photo is this gun. And that is a Mauser Cavalry carbine, an 1891 powdered cavalry carbine used by Spain and Argentina. And there it is, just past Pahaska in Wyoming in 1901. That gun probably shouldn't be there, but there it is. There's two possible ways it came that I can think of. Well, maybe three. One was that some of these were captured in the Spanish-American War and then sold through Bannerman's, but the first advertisement I can find for that is 1903. Another possible way is that Cody, of course, traveled in Europe pretty extensively, so who knows what kind of guns him and his crew acquired in Europe. And then what's another scenario that I think might be the case is that Cody, of course, recruited pretty heavily from South America for performers, because when he did his Congress of Rough Riders, he wanted to have people that had been there, so he hired ex-military folks and ranchers and that kind of thing out of South America, and it's very possible they brought one along as well. But that gun, I was surprised when I saw that photo and looked a little closer, but I think that's really interesting to see it on a hunting trip in 1901. So I went a little bit long. Do we have time for a couple questions, or want to move on to the next one? Okay, so I'll take a couple questions and then we'll get to the next folks. Anybody at all? Yes.
What's the is like the gap used like at all out here?
Yeah, so the question for everybody is, was the Gatling gun used in this area? Is that where we're headed? And the truth of the matter is that the Gatling guns really weren't used heavily. They mostly stayed in garrison. The troops kind of hated lugging them around. So there's about 3 or 4 written accounts of the Gatling gun being fired in anger in the American West. Most of them are in the Southwest. And most of them are sort of hard to piece together because there's a lot of sort of exaggeration in the writing. A good example would be the soldier, an officer writes down, we fought a skirmish and we rolled out the Gatling guns and we started firing and we killed, 100 enemy. Well, there's no engagement, they're wildly overestimating how many casualties they inflicted, and you can't really match that up. So it gets really hard to piece together how many times they were used in the West, but the answer is probably less than 4. So, yes, sir.
Do you happen to know what firearms Duke Alexei from Russia got on his smuggled hunting trip?
I wish I did, but I knew, the question was, do I know what firearms that Duke Alexei brought with him to the West when he was on his hunting trips? Unfortunately, I don't know what he had with him. So I imagine he brought some of his own. I imagine he borrowed some, but don't know what they are, unfortunately. Yes?
Wasn't the Remington pistol on the West as well? You mentioned the Colt, but wasn't the Remington?
Yeah. There would have been Remingtons out west, Remingtons, Smith & Wessons, a number of guns. I picked the Colt just because that was sort of the official standard issue. Of course, a secondary issue arm would have been the Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver. But yeah, the Remington certainly would have been, you probably could have found one.
36 caliber had a lot more than 6 rounds too.
There were still, most of the revolvers, even the Navy size revolvers, which are the 36 caliber guns, were still 6-shot. You don't see a lot of really 8-shot revolvers in that time period. Yes?
Did any of the 10-shot Walsh pistols end up in the Cody Museum, or did they all blow up?
The question was, did any of the Walsh pistols end up in our museum? Walsh pistols are what we call a superposed pistol, so the cylinders are very, very long, and that's because in every chamber of the cylinder you load 2 cartridges. And then hopefully, if the gun works, you fire the front one and then the back one out of each chamber. If it doesn't work, you fire both and blow up your gun. We do actually have a couple of Walshes in the collection, but that did survive and did not explode. A couple survived. Yes, sir.
Do you know how widespread the use of pepper box revolvers were?
That's a really good question. The question being, do I know how widespread the use of pepper box revolvers were? That's a really good question. I've never seen anything that would sort of illuminate that. The pepper boxes like Allen and Thurber's really, they come about in the pre-Civil War years, and Allen and Thurber do make quite a number of them. So it's pretty easy to imagine they show up in the West, but I've never really seen anything good on those, on just how many got out here.
I know that they were quite cheap, and
Yep.
many were made in the Civil War era.
Yep. Yeah, so they would have been definitely an option for somebody out in this area. And yes.
Did you say that William Cody is a member of the Rough Riders?
So William F. Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill and the namesake for the Center of the West, he's the guy that put on the Wild West. We're not supposed to, I'm contractually obligated not to call it the Wild West Show because he didn't call it that. He didn't like it. But it's the Buffalo Bills Wild West, and one of his, for several seasons, he, as part of the Wild West show that he put on, he had a group called the Rough Riders of the World. It was especially after the Rough Riders had made their name in Spain in the Spanish-American War, and so he hired performers from all over the world, Turkey, South America, Europe, and they would sort of perform as cavalry units from those areas. So he had Cossacks, he had Cuban revolutionaries, guys playing that. He had all sorts of folks, and that's what he called that group. All righty. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and I'll get out of your hair.